What's the password?
I see dead people.
The goal here isn't to like sensationalize anything or try to excuse what this guy did. It's more about like trying to wrap our heads around how something like this even happens, you know?
Absolutely.
Maybe learn something from it.
Right.
So just to set the scene a bit, Brynjar, he was targeting teenagers, like 13 to 16 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, on Snapchat. And he wasn't just like, using words to manipulate them. He was actually getting them hooked on OxyContin.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. And it makes you wonder, like, how does someone even get to that point? Like, what takes someone down that road?
Well, one thing that's really chilling about Brynjar's case is that, he wasn't some like shadowy figure hiding in the dark corners of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
He was right out there, active on Snapchat, blended right in with these teenagers.
Yeah.
And that accessibility, that's a huge part of why he was able to build trust and, manipulate these kids.
Yeah, and his tactics were like seriously messed up. He wasn't just, saying things to trick them. He was using the OxyContin as a way to control them.
Right.
In the source material, it says he would either downplay how dangerous the drug is or like he'd use their fear of fentanyl to pressure them into testing the oxy for him. Like, can you believe that?
Wow. So he was preying on their fears. That's messed up.
It's heavy stuff. And it's like, classic coercive control.
Exactly.
Where someone uses manipulation, threats, whatever they can to basically dominate another person.
Right. And in this case, Brynjar deliberately created this dependency. He got these kids hooked on something so that he could then use it against them.
Yeah.
To have that kind of power over them. It's truly disturbing, the level of like calculated manipulation.
I know. It's hard to even imagine being that dependent on something,
Yeah.
and then having someone use it against you like that.
Absolutely.
And the source material also mentions that Brynjar himself went through some serious trauma. He lost his dad when he was only 12.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's got to leave a mark.
Oh, for sure. I mean, losing a parent at that age,
Yeah.
it's got to shape you in some way.
Absolutely. And, while trauma is never an excuse for doing something like this, it is important to think about how those kinds of experiences can impact someone's like psychological development.
Right.
I mean, there's research that suggests early loss can make someone emotionally unstable, and they might have trouble forming healthy attachments.
Yeah.
And those are definitely factors that could contribute to someone behaving in harmful ways.
It's almost like, maybe Brynjar's inability to form those healthy attachments because of that early loss. Maybe that fueled his need to control and manipulate these kids. Like maybe that's how he learned to relate to people in a way that was all about dominance and using them.
That's a really interesting point, actually.
Yeah.
And while we can't definitively say that his trauma caused his actions, it does add like another dimension to understanding what might have motivated him.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that the source material highlights several red flags, things that suggest something deeper might be going on.
Oh, like what?
Well, like the constant lying.
Okay.
And how he always blamed his victims, calling them stalkers.
Seriously.
And just like a complete lack of empathy. It's like it all points toward a potential personality disorder,
Wow. That's pretty heavy. And that leads us to, well, maybe the most unsettling part of this whole thing. It's the possibility that Brynjar might have, like, psychopathy or narcissism.
Right.
The source mentions that his charm, his manipulation, and the fact that he was constantly lying, it all seems to fit with what we know about those disorders.
Yeah, it definitely raises some serious questions. And, just so our listeners are clear, psychopathy, it's all about a lack of empathy, no remorse, and this kind of superficial charm.
Right.
While narcissism, it's more about having an inflated sense of self-importance and needing constant admiration.
Okay.
And Brynjar's manipulative tactics, how he just didn't care about what he was doing to these kids, it all lines up with what you'd expect from someone with those traits.
It's honestly chilling to think that someone like that could be out there hiding in plain sight,
Yeah.
Preying on vulnerable kids. It makes you wonder, were there signs, like warning signs that people missed?
Right.
Were there opportunities to, like, intervene before it got to this point?
That's definitely a question we're going to dig deeper into later on.
Okay.
But it is important to remember that, identifying those signs early on, it's crucial. It's not just about punishing the people who do these things.
Yeah,
It's about preventing it from happening in the first place.
absolutely. And we can't forget about the victims in all of
Of
this.
course not.
These aren't just, statistics or some abstract concept. These are real kids whose lives have been completely changed by what Brynjar did.
Right.
And the impact on them, it's huge.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about potential lifelong struggles.
Yeah.
Addiction, problems with trust, anxiety, maybe even PTSD.
Oh, gosh.
And the fact that Brynjar actually labeled his victims as stalkers, that adds another layer of trauma. It
Yeah.
makes them doubt their own reality.
Yeah.
It just shows how insidious this kind of psychological manipulation can be.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to think about what they're going through, all because of this one person. It really makes you think about our own online interactions,
For sure.
and how vulnerable we all are, even in spaces that seem safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It underscores the need for more awareness, and proactive measures, especially when it comes to young people. They're often more susceptible to this kind of manipulation. And it's not just about individual responsibility either.
Right.
We need better safety measures online,
Yeah.
legal consequences that actually fit the severity of these crimes, and we need strong support systems for the victims.
It feels like this case is just like the tip of the iceberg, It raises so many more questions than it answers. But I think that's kind of the point of this whole deep dive, right?
I think so, yeah.
To get people thinking critically, to have these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, and ultimately to help protect the people who are most vulnerable.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
It's a conversation that needs to happen.
exactly.
Building on what we were just talking about, I think it's important to look at the bigger picture here. Like,
Yeah.
what does this case tell us about, society as a whole?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's easy to think, oh, this kind of stuff happens somewhere else, not my backyard. But
Yeah.
the truth is, these online predators, they can reach anyone, anywhere.
Right, they're not limited by geography or anything.
Exactly. And their reach is, well, it's pretty much unlimited thanks to the internet.
And that's what makes it so scary. I mean, we've all heard stories about kids being targeted on social media, but this case with Brynjar, it goes way beyond just, stranger danger.
Right.
He was using a highly addictive drug to control these teens. It's a whole other level of vulnerability.
Absolutely. And, platforms like Snapchat, they present a unique challenge.
How so?
Well, the way those messages disappear after you view them, it creates this false sense of security.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Like, it might seem great for just everyday chatting, but when it comes to something like this, predatory behavior, it makes it almost impossible to track.
Yeah, because the evidence just vanishes.
Exactly. And that leaves the victims feeling isolated, like nobody will believe them.
It's like they're trapped. So, given all that, what can we actually do to protect young people online? I mean, we can't exactly ban them from social media.
Right? Banning things rarely works. And sometimes it can even make things worse. It drives these activities further underground where we can't see them. I think the best approach is a multifaceted one.
Okay, I like that. Multifaceted.
Yeah. And a huge part of it has to be education.
Education for, like, the kids themselves.
For kids, for parents, for everyone. We need to have these open, honest conversations about online safety. We need to teach young people how to spot those red flags, and give them the confidence to speak up if something seems wrong.
But speaking up can be so hard, especially for someone who's being manipulated,
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to create a culture where victims feel supported, where they feel believed and empowered to share their experiences without being judged.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about talking to the kids, it's about educating the parents, too.
Exactly. Parents need to be aware of the risks. They need to know how to monitor their kids' online activity without being, too intrusive. And they need to be ready to step in if they have to. It's about finding that balance, respecting privacy, but also keeping them safe.
Seems like we need a major shift in how we think about online safety as a society, right? It can't just be an afterthought or something we talk about once a year.
I agree. This has to be an ongoing conversation, something that's integrated into our everyday lives.
For sure. And it goes beyond individual families too, right? We need system-wide changes.
Absolutely. We need better regulations for these social media platforms, stricter laws for online predators, and more funding for support services that can help victims of online exploitation.
Yeah, speaking of legal consequences, the source material really emphasizes that they need to reflect the severity of these crimes. But what does that actually look like?
That's a tough question. There's no easy answer. But I think it starts with recognizing that the damage these predators inflict, the psychological damage, it can be just as bad, if not worse, than physical harm.
Because the trauma can be so deep and so long-lasting.
Exactly. And I think our legal system needs to catch up to that reality.
So we need a new framework that addresses the specific nuances of these crimes.
Right, because the traditional approaches, they often fall short. The focus needs to shift away from just punishing people after the fact and move toward the more holistic approach that takes into account the long-term impact on the victims.
I like that. So what would that look like in practice?
Well, we need to consider things like longer sentences, mandatory treatment programs for offenders that address the underlying psychological issues that are driving this behavior.
Okay, so not just locking them up, but actually trying to rehabilitate them.
Exactly. And maybe even restrictions on internet access for those who are convicted of these crimes. It's about sending a clear message that this behavior won't be tolerated and holding them accountable for the full extent of their actions.
And we also need to make sure that victims have access to the support they need, right?
Absolutely. Therapy, counseling, support groups, all of that is crucial to help them heal and process what they've been through and rebuild their lives.
It's about empowering them to reclaim their lives and move forward. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have. It's a big topic.
From the impact on society to prevention to the legal system. But it's good that we're having this conversation, right? It means we're starting to really grapple with this issue.
I agree. The more we talk about these things openly and honestly, the better chance we have of breaking down the stigma that surrounds these types of crimes.
And that can help us identify potential problems early on, right? Create a safer online environment for everyone.
Exactly. Early intervention is key. It's not about waiting until something terrible happens and then reacting. It's about stopping it before it even starts.
And that means understanding the motivations behind these actions, right? And recognizing the warning signs, even the subtle ones.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the psychology of predators like Brynjar.
Right, trying to figure out the why behind it all.
If we can understand that, we can start to develop more effective interventions and prevention strategies.
That's where we're headed next.
That's right. We've laid out the problem, we've talked about the impact and some potential solutions. Now it's time to delve into the psychology, to try and make sense of what drives someone to commit these horrific acts.
Okay, I'm ready if you are. All right, so we've talked about the impact of Brynjar's actions and how we need better online safety and a legal system that can actually handle these kinds of crimes. But now I think we need to get into the most puzzling part of this whole thing, the psychology of the predator. What makes someone do something like this?
Yeah, trying to get inside the head of someone like Brynjar. It's not about excusing what he did. It's about, trying to see if there are warning signs, things that might help us understand how someone goes down such a dark path.
Right. It's like, how does someone who seems normal on the surface, how do they become capable of something so cruel?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. No single thing that turns someone into a predator. But there are patterns, things we can look for that might give us some clues. Pasted text, the source we've been looking at, it points to a few key areas: early trauma, the possibility of personality disorders, and manipulative tendencies. It's almost like all these risk factors just came together in Brynjar's case.
Yeah, and one thing that really stands out is Brynjar's own history of trauma. Losing his father when he was so young, it's got to have a huge impact on the kid.
Trauma, especially in childhood, it can leave a lasting mark. Something like losing a parent, it can really mess with a child's sense of security, make it hard for them to learn how to cope with their emotions.
So is it possible that trauma, could that be connected to why Brynjar seems to lack empathy? Like maybe because he couldn't form those close bonds? Maybe because of that loss, he needed to control and use other people?
It's definitely a connection worth exploring. Research shows that early trauma can actually impair the development of empathy, make it harder for someone to understand other people's feelings.
And then you add in the possibility of personality disorders like the source material talks about, it paints a pretty disturbing picture.
The source mentions psychopathy and narcissism. Those are complex disorders, but basically psychopathy is marked by a lack of empathy and remorse, along with this superficial charm. Narcissism is more about having an inflated sense of self-importance and a constant need for admiration. And looking at Brynjar's manipulation and how little he cared about his victims, it all lines up with those traits.
It's a scary thought that someone like that could be out there, blending in, using their charm to gain the trust of vulnerable kids. It makes you realize how important it is to be able to recognize the warning signs, even the subtle ones.
Absolutely. Early identification is key. But it can be hard to spot these individuals. They're often really good at hiding their true intentions, making themselves seem friendly and harmless. like Brynjar, he used social media to create this whole persona that appealed to his victims, building up their trust.